I'm pleased to welcome Harvey Heller and Julie Meyer to discuss issues with regard to insurance coverage. Harvey, tell us how a term of ambiguity can impact upon an insurance coverage.
Well, Henry, Julie and I have handled a host of insurance coverage disputes, and we can't remember any one where the claim of ambiguity has not been raised. And a claim of ambiguity simply is when an insured claims that the policy language is capable of more than one interpretation. And when you're able to prove that in court, the courts strictly construe the contract against the drafter. And the drafter is always the insurance company. So the problem happens when this occurs and a judge rules against an insurer, finds a clause ambiguous, and requires the insurance company to cover a loss that it never intended to cover, resulting in excess payments by the insurance carrier and a higher loss that must be distributed to other insureds, because insurance is risk transference and risk distribution.
Julie, tell us about the impact of late notice of a claim by an insured has under a claims made policy versus an occurrence policy.
Well, there's a significant difference between claims made coverage and occurrence coverage. A claims made policy is intended to cover losses that occur during the term of the policy, whereas in the context of an occurrence policy, the policy covers occurrences that take place during the term of the policy. And this is often overlooked by courts when they are interpreting insurance policies. One area where this comes into play often is in the context of late notice. Under an occurrence policy, the majority of jurisdictions have found that late notice is not a defense to coverage unless the insurer was somehow prejudiced by the late notice. In the context of a claims made policy, the vast majority of jurisdictions have found that late notice is a complete defense to coverage, regardless of whether the carrier was prejudiced. In Michigan, the issue is still unclear. There is authority in our state for the proposition that late notice, even in the context of a claims made policy, is not a complete defense to coverage unless there's an exception. If the insured can show that it gave notice as soon as practicable, then the carrier must show prejudice to deny coverage. And we are still waiting for the courts in this jurisdiction to decide this issue once and for all, so there is some clarity in Michigan. But it is an unclear issue in this state.
And I might add that right now we have 2 cases pending in federal court where that very issue is on the table, and we hope for a positive result in favor of the insurance carriers.
Julie, what happens when 2 insurance policies and carriers cover the same loss?
Well, there's 2 contexts in which this arises. You can have the situation where you have a primary policy and a true excess policy. And in that situation, the issue that often arises, and again, it's an ambiguity argument or a drafting issue, because it's always so critical to draft these policies clearly. And usually the excess policy is not implicated unless the underlying primary policy limits have been exhausted. In the context of the excess policy, you have to look at its language to determine when, in fact, exhaustion occurs, because the policies can be worded differently as to who has to pay the primary limits in order for exhaustion to occur, implicating the excess policy. The other context is where you would have multiple primary policies that would contain other insurance clauses. And depending on the language of that other insurance clause, one policy may be treated as a primary policy and the other treated as an excess policy. So again, it goes to the drafting and the importance of drafting with clarity.
And I might also add here, Henry, that this issue of competing insurance, 2 insurance policies covering the same loss, is very frequent. A landlord in a shopping center, the tenant in the shopping center. Landlord requires the tenant to make it an additional insured, but the landlord has its own insurance. The general contractor of a building project versus a subcontractor requiring the same situation, and you end up with overlapping coverages, and the insurance companies don't call each other and say, let's dovetail our other insurance clauses together.